Hey listeners, my name is Kay, and this is Dark Tales from the Road. Hey there everybody, thank you so much for joining me today. This is episode 33, and we are heading to Pennsylvania to explore the extremely haunted Eastern State Penitentiary. This was a fun one to research and to learn about. It has a huge history, plus it has some very, very dark history, and just the magnitude and hugeness of this building is incredible. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this one today. So I'm just going to jump on in. We're going to talk about the history of Pennsylvania first. If you're new here, I like to do a little bit of history surrounding the place that's haunted. So I'm going to talk about Pennsylvania, I'm going to talk about Philadelphia, and then I am going to jump into the subject, which is Eastern State Penitentiary, and I'll go over history and then really dive into the hauntings and the ghosts of the place. So that's how I do it. You can always skip forward if you would like to skip over the history, but either way works for me. This is just how I like to do it. Pennsylvania. It is one of the original 13 colonies and was founded by a man named William Penn, and he brought Quakers, his fellow Quakers, into Pennsylvania as like a safe haven. The capital of Pennsylvania is Philadelphia, and it was the site of First and Second Continental Congress in 1774 and 1775, and as most of us know, that's where the Declaration of Independence was signed, sparking the American Revolution. After the war, Pennsylvania became the second state to ratify the U.S. Constitution. If you remember when we did Delaware, they were the first to do that. Pennsylvania, of course, is very well known for what happened in that area during the American Civil War. And we all pretty much know about the Battle of Gettysburg, where a general named George Meade defeated Confederate General Robert E. Lee, which brought an end to the Confederacy's North invasion and then led to Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. So the first English colony that came up in the New World is known as Pennsylvania, and it was by King Charles II as a way to repay William Penn, because he was a member of the upper class nobility in King Charles's court, and his father had lent the king money before his death. So he repaid him with the area that is now Pennsylvania for him and his Quaker followers. So again, he was a Quaker. He was a supporter of the Society of Friends, which is a Quaker group that was very controversial at the time because they rejected rituals and different oaths, and they greatly opposed the war. So he brought them all to Pennsylvania to really have a safe haven for them, because they were being massively persecuted in the New World. And so along with the king owing him, he spoke with the king, and the king granted him the land of the territory between Maryland and New York. So then in 1681, King Charles signed the charter for Pennsylvania, and it was officially proclaimed on April 2nd of 1681. And so then the king decided to name that colony after Penn's father, Admiral William Penn Sr. Before he died, he actually wanted the land to be named Sylvania, which is Latin for woods, but Charles II, he kind of took that and revised it into Pennsylvania to be able to name it after Penn's father. But then William Penn II was really worried that people were going to think it was named after him and the repercussions that were going to come from that. So around that area were the Lenape Indians, and Penn put himself out there for these people, for his Quakers, and really sought peace with them, because in that area they were the most prominent Native American tribes in that region. They actually signed a treaty called the Treaty of Shakamakson. I hope I said that right. I'm so sorry. In 1682, and it really formalized that land and the peace between those two groups. But as we all kind of know through history, that relationship broke down. There were a lot of years that resulted in miscommunication. There were more English coloners coming into Pennsylvania, huge land expansion, diseases, and transfers of power. So Penn, when he passed away, he gave the land to his sons, John and Thomas, who started selling parts of the land without consent from the Lenapes. Eventually, the colonial officials actually called on the Iroquois to help remove the Lenape from the land in 1741. So then the Lenape transferred to Indiana, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and then splintered off into different groups. During the 1800s, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania really blew up because of industry production, and they were huge in manufacturing. Their industry actually extended overseas and brought over more people into Pennsylvania from Germany, the Far East, South America. I have ancestors that are German and were in Pennsylvania. Very cool. And just like a lot of the major cities at the time, the immigrants grouped themselves by income and ethnicity around the city. In the 1900s, education began to expand. There were colleges and universities opening. The University in Pennsylvania had several graduate programs, and they admitted women and students of color, which is pretty cool. There was also a women's medical college of Pennsylvania, and they brought in Black women from the South, plus other students from like India, Japan, Syria, and it was the only college in the world at the time that would actually train female physicians. In Philadelphia, it was the first to have Mass celebrated in an American Catholic church and the first U.S. hospital. So this is known for a lot of firsts. This was a huge deal in American culture, this area. Isaac Hershey, he purchased land that is known today as Dauphin County. Chocolate had not been invented yet, and it was not popular, obviously. But his grandson, Milton Hershey, he became one of the most famous chocolatiers in the world, and their entire homestead changed into the chocolate capital of the country. They broke ground on the first Hershey chocolate factory in Derry Township, Pennsylvania, and the first chocolate was sold commercially April 17th of 1895, and they started marketing their chocolate bars in 1900. Then the Hershey factory wasn't completed until 1905. So, because of all the success surrounding it, Milton Hershey was actually able to fund the town of Hershey, and he opened a Hershey Industrial School to bring in orphans in that area also, which is very cool. Some interesting notes that I found: Governor William Penn, after he came to the New World in 1682, he combined the Greek words phileo and adelphius, which mean love and brother, and used that to name Philadelphia, and then its nickname came from that, the city of brotherly love. In 1777, there was a lot of fear going around about the British Army seizing the Liberty Bell so that they could melt it down for ammunition. So 200 men came in and transported the Liberty Bell by caravan from the Philadelphia State House to the basement of a church in Allentown, and it actually remained there until the British finally left in 1778. Now it sits in front of the Independence Hall. It's actually the same bell that's up in the bell tower because it has a big crack in it, all that. July of 1952, a man named Jonas Salk, He was the first to develop the polio vaccine from the virus while he was at University of Pittsburgh. He actually tested it on himself and his family first, and then with all that success, it was then made available worldwide just a few years later. And it caused the number of polio cases to go down from 29,000 in 1955 to less than 6,000 in 1957. That's insane. That's a huge drop. That's pretty cool. And lastly, not so fun a fact, the worst nuclear accident in the United States occurred on 3 Mile Island near Harrisburg. And this was March 28th of 1979. There were some major system malfunctions and human errors, and the plant's reactor core partially melted. And so then thousands of people were evacuated from that area and really feared the exposure that came from the core and all that radiation being in the air. So let's jump into Philadelphia. Again, we all know its name means the city of brotherly love, and it was actually first settled by Native American tribes, mostly the Lenape tribes, around 8000 BC. 1684, the ship named Isabella, it landed in Philadelphia and was carrying hundreds of slaves. So slavery became a huge tension in the area, especially among the local Quakers, and it resulted with a German petition against slavery. It was an organized protest against slavery in the New World, and that was in 1688. Philadelphia is a huge area for shipbuilding at that time in the colonies, and Ben Franklin was a huge part of that. He, in 1729, actually became the publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette also. So kind of going back to the Liberty Bell, the Pennsylvania State House, which now is known as Independence Hall, they had their first meeting in 1735, and they had ordered a large bell for the building in 1751, and it had a biblical inscription on it that said, quote, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land until all the inhabitants therefore." British Parliament then came in and passed a series of taxes on the colonies in the 1760s, and that included the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, and outrage went crazy. With all that, the Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in 1774. And that's when Thomas Paine's pamphlet called Common Sense became extremely widespread, and it set this huge stage to really have the U.S. declare independence from Britain. And then our founding fathers, they did it July 4th, 1976, and the people in Philadelphia were actually the very first to hear the Declaration of Independence read aloud, because they read it out in the State House yard. So after the Revolutionary War around 1790, Philadelphia was actually the capital of the United States, because it was the newest nation, the newest big city, and it had about 44,000 residents. The first Bank of the U.S. and the first U.S. Mint were founded in Philadelphia, and the U.S. Constitution was written there also in 1787. Again, still struggles with slavery and civil rights, and the group called the Pennsylvania Abolition Society met there in 1775, and it was an ideal spot for a man named William Lloyd Garrison. He created the group American Anti-Slavery Society, and it grew to over 250,000 members by 1838. In 1876, Susan B. Anthony delivered the Declaration of Rights of Women right outside Independence Hall. So Philadelphia is growing like crazy. During the Gilded Age, that city expanded immensely. A lot of wealthy neighborhoods started to grow along like the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Even the first zoo and Centennial Exhibition Fair were also in Philadelphia. Like we said earlier, shipbuilding industry was huge in that. And so it had contributed to so many different things and was a huge contributor to World War I as an ally. But right at that time, 1918 to 1919, the Philadelphia was the epicenter of the Spanish flu pandemic. Over 500,000 citizens got this disease. So sad. Then World War II comes. Afterwards, new highways were being built. This allowed workers to easily commute outside the city. Suburbanization came around, and that made the industries there really decline. They lost a lot of people and a lot of jobs, and their shipyards really started to decline immensely. With that, there was a crazy poverty and racial tensions like no other. In 1985, there was actually a police confrontation by the radical group called MOVE, which was horrible, and it ended in a bombing of a black neighborhood, killing 11 people. And this was the compound of MOVE. So there were 11 people killed on their compound by the police. Over the years, new developments came about in Philadelphia. They built the Philadelphia Navy Yard and Center City, and that really brought life to this area again. And so now in Philadelphia, there are more than 1.5 million residents. A little fun fact to end out Philadelphia. Visitors, it's a huge thing to go see is the statue of Rocky Balboa. And in the article it said, depicting the fictional boxer and its arms outstretched at the top of the steps of the Philadelphia Art Museum. So if you have not seen Rocky, you should watch it because it's the best. But Sylvester Stallone plays Rocky, and that art museum is famous. He runs up 72 steps because he's training for a fight. And so now, and he does it in other movies too, because like the crowd will follow him up the stairs. And now the stairs of the museum are known as the Rocky Steps. I'm pumped. I'm ready. Let's talk about Eastern State Penitentiary because it's cool. So Eastern State Penitentiary was a former prison in Philadelphia, and it was open from 1829 until 1971. There were some very famous criminals that were housed there, like Al Capone and the bank robber Willie Sutton. And this building was extremely innovative, especially for that time, and it was built as a wagon wheel design. So you have the center of the wagon wheel, and then the spokes go out from there, and that's how it was laid out. I'll put some pictures on Instagram and YouTube and Facebook, all the places, to really show how it looked, because it is crazy how big this place is and what that wagon wheel design actually looked like. This was the largest and most expensive public structure ever in the United States. And a lot of prisons took the same model and replicated it in their area. There were actually 300 prisons worldwide that adopted the teachings and style at Eastern State Penitentiary. There was a jail open at the time named Walnut Street Jail. It's actually located right behind Independence Hall, and it was horrible. Conditions were appalling. They actually housed men, women, adults, and children, thieves, murderers, and they all were stuck in this disease-ridden area. The pens were extremely dirty, and while in there, rape happened because they were all stuffed in here and, being robbed, all that stuff. At the Walnut Street Jail, a lot of the jailers, they really didn't care. they put very little into protecting these people, especially from each other. They would actually sell the prisoners for alcohol. And they would do this, and they would actually get up to 20 gallons of it a day. So how much were they selling these people? Where were they selling them? And I don't know if it was like selling them to another inmate for them to be raped. I don't know, but it's very interesting to think about. The food, the heat, and the clothing all came at a price too. So if you couldn't afford to have food or heat or clothing in this jail, a lot of prisoners died from the cold and from starvation. In 1787, a man named Dr. Rush, who is actually known as the father of American psychiatry and psychology, he stood up and said, we need a change. Not just at the Walnut Street Jail, but everywhere. We needed prisons, and we needed them set up differently. He said this. Quote, he was convinced that crime was a moral disease and suggested a house of repentance where prisoners could meditate on their crimes, experience spiritual remorse, and undergo rehabilitation. So some changes were made at Walnut Street Jail. They segregated by sex and crime. They had vocational workshops set up to help fill the time. And a lot of the abuse that was going on was coming way down. But even with all that, it wasn't enough because Philadelphia was blowing up. Their population was growing like crazy. So that brought in more criminals. So they decided that they needed a bigger prison of huge scale, like they know, to be able to help society out and really be able to house all of them and all of them safely. And they believed, we'll talk about this more, but their biggest belief is that complete isolation of each prisoner would be ideal. But in Walnut Street Jail, it was impossible because it was so overcrowded. So Eastern State was designed by a man named John Haviland, and it opened October 25th of 1829, and it's considered to be the world's first true penitentiary. So they had this different idea of incarceration, especially during that time, and they called it the Pennsylvania system, or a separate system. And it encouraged separate confinement to rehabilitate these people. It wasn't made to just punish them, but to help the criminals find God using spiritual reflection and change. Really believed that the criminals, if they were exposed to complete silence and they could only think about their behaviors and their crimes, they would become penitent. Another part of it was that the warden was legally required to visit every inmate every day. And the overseers were mandated to see each inmate 3 times a day. This Pennsylvania system was very different from what was happening in New York, known as the Auburn system or the New York system, which the prisoners were forced to work together, but still in silence. They were subject to immense physical punishment. Like Sing Sing Prison is an example of the Auburn system. Auburn system was majorly favored in the U.S., but when Eastern State's massive building, floor plan, all of that, and then their system of complete solitary confinement came into play, like I said earlier, it became a model for over 300 prisons. Originally, it was designed for 7 one-story cell blocks, but by the time cell block 3 was completed, the prison was already over capacity. So then all of the floors ended up having 2 floors, and then towards the end of construction, Cell blocks 14 and 15 were very quickly built to help with the overcrowding, and it was actually built and designed by the prisoners. So cell block 15 is death row, and it was the very last cell block to be added, and it was used for the inmates waiting on death row, the worst of the worst. But surprisingly, no inmates were ever executed at Eastern State. They were actually sent to Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, and the state that had, and there was a death chamber. So they would go there to live out their final days. When Eastern State was first open, inmates, they were in their cells 23 hours a day. So when it first started opening, the cells were not accessed by a certain door. Each cell kind of had like a backyard. They had an exercise yard attached to it. So you would have to go through the exercise yard into a very small door. And like you had to crouch to get in there. And they only used it to put, for them to get in and out and pass their meals. But it became extremely impractical. So during constructions, they started changing them, and it allowed the prisoners to enter and leave their cell blocks through their cells. So they had a metal door that would swing in to their cell, and then they had a heavy wooden door that would slide in front of it so you couldn't hear any noises. This place is so huge, it's like a castle, and they really wanted it to feel like a church. There's some that say that the small doors that they had to go through at the beginning was so that it would minimize the attack of an officer, because they had to crouch down, things like that. Others say that the doors were to force the prisoners to bow entering their cell, and it was to relate it to penance and, religious inspiration in the prison. They were all made of concrete, and they had one single skylight. Some of them had a light fixture and some didn't. But this skylight was significant because they said it was representing the eye of God. And so prisoners were told that God was always watching them. And like I said, like the back door, you could go to an individual area for exercise, but the walls were so high and concrete, you couldn't even communicate with other prisoners. And they synchronized it so that no two prisoners would be right next to each other, to make sure they're not out there at the same time, they're not talking to each other. And they stayed in their exercise yards. They did not go outside anywhere else, but they did allow them to garden, and they could actually keep pets in their little exercise yard, which makes me feel sad for the pet. So some of the punishment that went on there, it's not good. It's pretty horrible. So they started out with a system called the individual treatment system, and they thought this was going to be the most effective. A prisoner would be taken out of their cell, but they had to have this hood over their head so that they couldn't be recognized by prisoners, and to try to minimize the talking amongst themselves type of thing. And they would take them to get punished. Nobody wanted it to be true, but the guards at this place, when it came to being punished, they had put in physical and psychological torture into their regime for any infraction. And so some of the things they would do is they would douse a prisoner in freezing water outside during the months. They had a contraption that it would chain your tongue to your wrists. So if you struggled against the chains, you would tear your tongue. There is a chair that they would strap prisoners in with very, very tight leather restraints for days. And then a lot of the extremely bad the worst criminals, they would be put in a pit called the Hole. And it was an underground cell block that is under cell 14. No light, no human contact, and very little food. And they would be in there for almost 2 weeks. But on the bright side, when they built this place, the accommodations were very advanced. They had faucets with running water and a flush toilet. They also had curved pipes along part of one of the walls, and that helped to serve as central heating during the winter months because hot water would be run through them to keep the cells heated. And it says toilets were remotely flushed twice a week by the guards. So if you it had to sit in there. Gross. But even Andrew Jackson was in the White House at this time, and he still used a chamber pot. They did not have these accommodations at the White House yet. So interesting. Like the Walnut Street Jail, Eastern State was doomed to fail because of the rapid growth in Philadelphia. It was meant to originally hold 300 prisoners. By the 1920s, it was forced to house 2,000 more. And then just more and more and more cells kept being constructed, including ones that were built below ground, without windows, no light or plumbing. So the pit, they probably had multiples of these. And eventually, solitude was not redeeming these criminals. It was pure punishment. So like I said, it was the most expensive project, and it was a huge public works project and has been a tourist destination since then. It was also a tourist destination for notable visitors. Charles Dickinson, Alexis de Tocqueville, and some other notable inmates like Willie Sutton and Al Capone, they were all there. And they allowed visitors to speak with the prisoners in their cell to prove to these outsiders, look, they're not completely isolated, but they would never allow to have visits from friends or family during their stay. So only these random people could come sit and talk with you because they're trying to tell the public, but you can't have your friends or family, you have no voice, nothing. So Alex de Tocqueville, he praised this concept. He wrote about it in his 1831 trip. He said, quote, "Can there be a combination more powerful for reformation than solitude? Leads a prisoner through reflection to remorse, through religion to hope, makes him industrious by idleness?" Question mark. And in 1842, Charles Dickens visited the penitentiary, and he was the complete opposite. He said the solitary confinement was like being buried alive. He said this quote, "In its intention, I am well conceived that it is kind, humane, and meant for reform. But I am only the more convinced that there is a depth of terrible endurance in it which no man has right to inflict upon his fellow creature. I hold this slowly and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body." At Eastern State, they have a death ledger that started in the 1800s when it first opened, and it was a book that kept track of all the deaths that occurred there, as well as the causes behind it. There's over 1,000 entries in there, and one of the most common deaths there was suicide by hanging. And then a close second was tuberculosis. Interestingly enough, I don't know if this is funny or not, but masturbation was actually listed on the death ledger as a cause of death for several of the inmates. Yes, it's extremely unusual cause of death, but at that time, they believed that masturbation led to illnesses and death because of how it affected your mind, There were 18 cases of insanity that were listed in the penitentiary's reports, and 2/3 of it were thought to have been caused by excessive masturbation. I don't know if it's funny or not. I'm sorry. In 1945, there was a major escape. There were like 12 men who were all involved in all of it. But there was one where Willie Sutton and like two others were able to escape, but they were found, And so over the course of years, when they were doing certain constructions and stuff like that, they found a tunnel 97 feet or 30 meters under the prison wall. And so, doing these renovations and more construction, they found 30 more incomplete inmate tunnels. So that's insane to have 197 feet under the prison. It's, Shawshank, that's insane. 30 more tunnels. So their mode of solitary confinement didn't work anymore. Overcrowding was becoming a huge problem. So by 1913, they abandoned solitary. They actually started up a new way as a congregate prison until it closed in 1970. The prison was closed, actually 1971, and all the prisoners and guards were transferred to a new prison, Great Orford Prison, which is about 30 miles or 5 kilometers northwest of Eastern State. The city of Philadelphia purchased the property to redevelop it. There were a lot of proposals, including a mall, luxury apartments, all within the old prison walls. So when you see a picture of this place, I can't picture any of that going in there. And then there was an abandonment period, which lasted from 1971 when they closed until the late 80s. The plants and everything grew around it all. They were in the cells and outside, all over the outside of the walls. And so up until 1994, it had been taken over and it was opened to the public for history tours, and now it's open for ghost tours. So it's a museum, it's a historic site. They do guided tours or audio tours. And it says, it's narrated by Steve Buscemi, with former guards, wardens, and prisoners also contributing. So that's interesting. And they have a scavenger hunt for children. When you're there, you are allowed to walk around, and you can go into solitary confinement cells. But there are a lot that are still off limits. A lot of areas also that are off limits because of deterioration, the walls breaking down and stuff like that. So when you see this building, it's huge. It's ominous. It's got this dark atmosphere along with its long history. Some famous inmates that were there. So Alfonso Scarface Capone, he was Chicago's most famous mob boss. He was in Eastern State for 8 months because he was arrested for carrying a concealed and deadly weapon, and this was his first prison sentence. His room, you can still see it today, was very luxurious. He could decorate it however he wanted. He had a bed, a couch, a lamp, a radio, he had, very expensive furniture, rugs, and all that fun stuff. Another one, his name is Victor Babe Andreoli. Yeah. He was convicted of killing a Pennsylvania state trooper in 1937. He was serving a life sentence at Eastern State for first-degree murder, and he actually escaped in 1943 by hiding in a delivery truck that was leaving the prison. They did catch up to him and find him, and he was at a diner in Chester, Pennsylvania, and he was shot dead. Next, we have Morris the Rabbi Bulber. He was in Eastern State in 1942, serving a life sentence as a member of an arsenic murder ring in Philadelphia. Yeah. He was called, quote, a veteran witch doctor and compounder of charms. He was actually one of the leaders of the group, and the group appealed to women who wanted to murder their husbands, because at that time, a lot of them were using arsenic. And so, yes, they used arsenic, but there were actually a lot of other methods that they used too. And they were killing their husbands to collect insurance money. In the 1930s, the group were responsible for at least 30 deaths. 16 men and women were eventually convicted for participating in this group. So, pretty crazy. I had never heard about that one. True crime people, that might be a cool one to explore more. Another one named Leo Callahan, he actually escaped. Among everyone who tried to escape, he was the only one that got away with it. He was in there for assault, a battery, and intention to kill, and he had made a wooden ladder that helped him get out. Him and 5 other prisoners, this was in 1923, they built a ladder to scale one of the walls of the penitentiary. The other 5 people were recaptured, but Callahan, it says, is still at large, but I'm pretty sure he's not around anymore. It says he would be more than 110 years old. But yeah, he was the only one that got away with it. It's pretty crazy. It says approximately 100 people tried to escape from Eastern State. 2 more here. We have Frida Frost. She was a female prisoner, and they did house females for like 100 years. So it's not really talked about how much the female impact on it, but Frida was one of like the last women to stay there, and she was transferred to the Muncie Industrial Home for Women, and it really marked an end of an era. She had been there for 20 years for a sentence of murder because she had poisoned her husband. And last, we have William Francis Slick Willie Sutton. He is a very famous bank robber in American history. He spent 11 years at Eastern State. In 1949, along with other prisoners, they escaped from Eastern State in a prisoner-dug tunnel that was almost 100 feet underground. We had talked about this earlier. But it was, once they got in and came out the other side, they were captured right away. They made it through the tunnels, but once they hit the outside of the prison, they were done for. And during his career as a criminal, he is credited with over 50 bank robberies and 3 successful escapes from the prison. And he died in 1980 after serving over 30 years behind bars. So, okay, let's get into what you guys all came here for. Ghosts of the penitentiary. So, it is notorious, known as an extremely haunted, I probably say this with everything, but one of the most haunted places in the U.S. It is believed the ghosts of the inmates who suffered there have come back to return to exact revenge. There's a lot of theories, but that's one of them. There have been so many paranormal activities reported that range from laughter, footsteps, bangs, and a lot of shadowy figures. So in cell block 12, it said that it is the most haunted cell block in the institution. And when they've toured this place, they claim to hear high-pitched laughter and a lot of whispers. Another popular story from there is a locksmith. His name was Gary Johnson. He was kind of changing out all the padlocks because they were all rusted shut, and he encountered apparitions. So during just a routine thing that he was doing around all the locks, he claimed to have seen a horde of apparitions. Very, very dark, and he felt extremely cold, and he felt them like touching them, like putting their hands in his pockets. Very, very weird, and he just had this very ominous, dark feeling, and dark thoughts started to come into his head. Very, very bad. And many people have also reported the same thing in that area while also being watched and hearing cries. Cell block 6, a shadowy figure is known to be seen darting along the walls. Cell block 4, people see ghostly faces, and they've also seen like a silhouette of a guard in one of the towers. They hear footsteps, wails, whispers, and it's just the same over and over and over again. It's kind of crazy. One of the staff members said they do not like to exploit the prison's dark history. He said that a lot of people, he said this quote, "Most people making TV shows come in here looking for ghosts. That's not the story we tell. Inmates were real people. They were people's lives. 70,000 people spent time in here, and we're not going to glorify it, and we're not going to make fun of it." So they really are very serious about their history, and I think they're very serious about their ghosts too, like not wanting different crews to come in and really take advantage of what's there, I guess is what I want to say. I'm not sure. So, Ghost Adventures went there, guys. Saki baby, love you. He does a big tour. We learn kind of the same history that we just learned. But here's some of the interviews that he did. He talked to a woman named Catherine Davis. She's an author, but she's also witnessed a lot of things there. So she was walking around cell block 4 with Zach, talking about things, and she just instantly felt cold. She felt like this gust of cold went around them, and Zach said he could feel it too. And then she got extremely emotional. She was like about to cry. She just had this extreme, overwhelming sadness. And she said that area is, giving her all of this emotion. And she said when we were here as a group, all the others actually started to cry too. And they said after a while, we were standing there as a group talking, and they were hungry. So they were talking about food, and they caught a voice on their, I don't know if it was camera or recorder or what, but someone saying, and then a cold chill went through the entire group. So maybe they were excited about the food. I don't know. Some other facts here. So some of the deaths and murders that were there. An officer was killed by inmates. Officers were killed by inmates. And one was a man named Joseph Taylor in 1830. He disassembled a sewing machine and clubbed an officer to death in the exercise yard. Mental illness was rampant because of what was going on, and he was convinced the guards were poisoning him. And he said, quote, "I remember hitting him the first time, but nothing after that." So when he was done, before he got caught, he just went back to his cell and fell asleep. Very, very weird. And that's the same exercise yard where the negative energy and the locksmith experienced that ghost, or all those ghosts. And also, inmates were known to push guards over the railing when the metal door was closed. It was so close to that metal door that they could push hard enough to be able to push them over the edge. And we've talked about that at other prisons and stuff like that, where now they have wire or bars set in between so that when they were pushed, they would not fall. But it said many guards were pushed and fell to their death. In 1829, there was a hospital built, and TB ran rampant throughout the prison. In some of the interviews, Zach actually got to see the original death ledger and touch it and hold it. And the ledger was from 1830, and he was reading some of the deaths off. And one of them struck my eye. So his cause of death was suicide by cutting throat. He was a laborer. He was in there for robbery, and he was 38 years old. And again, masturbation was in there, and, Zach was all giddy and funny about that. But there were some forms of torture. We had briefly talked about them earlier, but I wanted to mention them again because I got to see it more on the episode. I do recommend this episode. I thought it was very, very good. So if an inmate did not obey communication policy, they would use this item called an iron gag. So, like, it would clamp around their tongue, and I'll post a picture of this also. And then it was chained to their wrists on their back. So, pretty much any movement would tear their tongue up or off. Just very, very weird. There was also the mad chair, which we spoke about. And they would be put in there for punishment, put in the leather straps till it was cutting off their circulation, and they would be left in there with no food. A lot of them died from insanity and starvation. Just, yeah. We talked about Al Capone, but an aspect of his stay there was he felt like he was haunted by someone from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Guards had experienced hearing him yelling in his cell, saying, "Go away, leave me alone." And so Zach and the tour guide were in there, and they started hearing noises while they were in the middle of the interview. It was very weird. Catherine, who we talked about earlier, who was the author, they were in the men's shower area. She said with their group, she made a joke about not dropping the soap, and something came up behind her and smacked her in the butt. That would be so weird. Oh my gosh. In the rotunda area, which is the center of the wagon wheel, they were interviewing a tour guide, and he said he had taken his tour on a certain part, and then he was passing the group off to another gal to take them down another hallway, and he bumped into a man who was lagging behind, and he was talking to the man. He said, you better go, they're going to leave you behind. And so he watched and all of a sudden the guy's gone, but he turns and you can see him walking down the hallway, and then he just fades away. Very creepy. Another witness, a man in his group was calling out the inmates' names and cursing at them. Just not appropriate behavior, And he said that all of a sudden this guy was forcefully pushed out of his cell. And he said the guy, was so scared, calling for his mom. It was scary. So I talked about, the doors for the exercise area being super tiny, but the doors of the cells were also very short. You would hit your forehead or something. I don't know how tall they actually were, but the spirits kind of intervene. They say that a lot of tall men, they're trying to duck their head or whatnot. They feel someone pulling on the back of their head or pushing up their chin to make them hit their heads on the top of the door. And there were men who was like, I was trying really hard to duck, but for some reason I couldn't, and I hit my head. So very weird. Another witness said they were in a cell on death row, which is the cell block 15, and they were talking about a man named Elmo Smith, who was an inmate there, and he made fun of his name. And right behind him comes up and something smacks him right in the shoulder. So finally we get to lockdown, and Zach starts running through, acting like a guard, taunting, saying, I'm opening every cell. And so all of them go to cell block 12 and still taunting. Nick is doing the same thing now too. They hear a noise inside a cell. They hear knocking. So they shut themselves in the cell, just Zach and Aaron. They start hearing footsteps. So Aaron's outside the door and he's talking, taunting, saying, come get me. Gets a massive, huge EMF spike. So they were actually doing an EVP session while they were in there, and they said a question kind of like, it's not right to be locked up, right? And then an EVP came through. It's very clear that said, I knew God. They also caught a disembodied voice that said hungry, but it sounded very, very creepy, like alien-like. And so after they leave cell block 12, the camera later caught someone saying, hi. I just love when the EVPs come, man. They're just so creepy. I love it. So then they go back to the rotunda, and they go through door number 2, down cell block 2. And something just hits Zach. He's feeling a very weird energy field around him. And then a noise came from the mad chair room. So Zach straps into the chair. They have 2 recorders going, and Aaron's in the hallway again. So they start hearing noises in the hallway. Aaron is freaking out. He's hearing very eerie sounds. There was a sound of a cell opening. And Zach is asking questions, and more sounds scraping down the hallway, clawing, footsteps. And so Zach is, egging them on, trying to get more sounds from the other cells, from his cell. And an EVP came through that said, "Get out." And then Aaron saw a shadow figure at the exact same time. Just, ugh. So then they start going outside. And then they're lost. But they hear a tapping on a door. Some random door outside. And so they come up to it, and they're like, asked it to knock back again. And then it replied. But then completely stopped. They couldn't get it to do any more. Then they found another door. And this place was filled with coffins. And they could hear so many knocks and creaks and footsteps in there. It was, old building with old coffins in there, but still, like, you imagine you open the door and there's just constant, like, there's just so many coffins in there. They were also taking digital still photos, and out of, like, the 300 photos they took, there was one where it was in succession, so, of one spot. So the first one was normal. The second one had this very white mist and bright light, and then the next one was normal. So all of a sudden, this white mist thing had appeared and then disappeared. So they decided to split up. Zach went to Al Capone's room. While he was in there, he heard a very weird noise, but there wasn't a lot going on in there. He eventually left, and the camera caught a man shouting. So Aaron, I didn't write down where he was. He was in a hallway, one of the cell blocks, but he was in there by himself, hearing crazy noises. He's not sure where he is in the hallway. He turns freezing cold, and he just hears footsteps up and down, and you can hear all of it because it was caught on camera on his recorder. And he instantly flips out because he feels like someone just came up behind him really, really quick. So after he left the hallway, or as he was leaving the hallway, loud bangs just everywhere. He bolted. And then Nick went to the solitary yard where that guard was killed. He got an EVP that said Nick. And while he was asking for noises, he asked a lot of different questions and still wasn't really getting a lot. But again, after he left, they caught a scream on the camera. It's very creepy to listen to. And then the battery just completely died. So someone took that energy to create that scream. It was just very scary. And granted, they didn't get a ton, but it was a really cool episode. And it seems like that place is crazy haunted. I also actually watched another show called Portals to Hell. I get both of these on Discovery Plus, and this one is where Jack Osborne hosts, and he does it with a co-host named Katrina. You've probably seen Katrina on a bunch of other things. She did the one with Nick when he parted ways with Ghost Adventures, and she's been on a couple more, but she's good. So they're talking on their way there, and I liked what she said. She said it was made to look like a medieval castle, Eastern State was, because it wanted to strike fear into the people who were thinking of committing crimes, which honestly makes sense because it's very big and very ominous, and like just right on the street when you drive by it, it's very crazy. So they were talking with witnesses, doing interviews, and they spoke with a guy named Zach, not Zachy Baby. And him and his buddies went on a tour. He went to cell block 1 and went into a cell by himself. He felt something on his back. He turned around and he heard a child giggle and then someone saying, "Watch your back." Ooh. So he turned back towards the door and he saw a face with 2 dark eyes. So the door was closed, so it was dark, but he saw a face with 2 dark eyes. And ever since then, he couldn't sleep. While they were finishing the tour, though, they heard about the masks that they would wear to transport them around the prison, and he knew that's what he saw. He saw a man with that mask on in that cell. So creepy, and you could just see in his face, like, he was struggling to tell the story because of the trauma that came from it. They also spoke with some guys named Aaron and Matt. They worked there giving tours. While they were walking around with them, they completely lost audio. They kept rolling, but just everyone was out, no audio. Then Jack's carrying around an EMF, and it's just going crazy. It's just back and forth, and squeaking, all that stuff, and he feels some pressure on his cheek. He gets extremely anxious, and he just said, "It feels like I have this massive weight on me." They also went to cell block 3, and they said it had never been investigated before. It was the hospital. So they're walking around the hospital, talking in the interview, and Katrina starts feeling extremely anxious and has extreme back pain. Like, she instantly pipes up and she's like, "Guys, has anyone had an issue with back pain in here?" And they're like, "No, I don't think so." She's like, "I'm having extreme back pain. I'm very, very uncomfortable." And you could see it in her face and stuff. It's kind of crazy. And so Matt and Aaron threw in this little story, and I wanted to add it because there's an inmate. His name was John Frankfurt. He died in 1896 because he was dissected by a doctor there because he was really interested in the brain and the organs of someone who was a career criminal. And they had seen him walking around, at that time with a pail full of organs, and they said that his ghost is also seen like that. Ugh. So a lot of experiments were happening at the hospital. People didn't always just die of disease or age or whatever. They were being completely cut open, dissected, and experimented on. They also went to the death row 2nd floor. It said it's never been investigated before. So take what you want. I don't know if it had or not, but this is, death row was the worst of the worst. And they said that when people were there, they felt an extremely violent energy. They would get, like, on record, on their recorders, of people threatening them, saying, "I'll kill you." Everything about that area just extremely aggressive and very ugly. So they're still continuing their interviews, and the light equipment cuts out. Again, they keep rolling. Their gear is going erratic. The REM pod starts going off and beeping like crazy, and Jack's just holding it. The producer gets massive chills, and so Jack's standing there with the REM pod, and he's like, "Is anyone here right now?" And the pod goes off. Then it says, "Is this how you want to communicate?" And it goes off again. And then he asks, "Are you okay with us being here?" No response. Talking with his producer, and they're like, "Well, I would take that as a no." So it cuts to Jack and Katrina. They're talking alone, I think still down a hallway, and they hear a clanking noise. Jack said that he saw someone down the hallway, and he starts yelling, "Hello." He runs down there, and you can hear talking and music. Jack saw a very dark shadow across the hall. They could hear music playing. They finally get down there, and it's a part of an exhibit, this radio, and it had to be turned on by a switch, like a light switch. So they turned it off, And they were kind of messing around, that would take a lot to turn it on and off. And then they're trying to turn it back on and it will not come back on. So, like, they didn't hear this music until all of a sudden it started playing and you could hear people talking. It's very, very creepy. They spoke with another witness. Her name was Amy. She works at the penitentiary at Halloween. She says a lot of what they do is they scare people, but they also abduct people. They'll put hoods over their heads and put them in a real cell. And I thought that was creepy. I had to include that. But she had an experience where she went into a cell alone. She could hear something growling in the corner. And then a dark entity moved towards her and had her backing up forcefully, where she was eventually forcibly pushed out of the cell and she ran. And she said it was cell block 1 towards the end. And she said she's gone through so much trauma, very emotional. She has insomnia, night terrors, and it felt like there was a very angry, trapped prisoner in that cell. So very similar to what Zach said in his interview. So they started their investigation, and they brought in a gal named Michelle, who is a medium psychic. She knows nothing about Eastern State, which I didn't know anything about it until I saw Ghost Adventures. I started getting into podcast stuff like that. So it could be true that she really had no clue about this place. So she's standing at base camp and she's like, I can feel how haunted it is just by standing here. So they do what they call the psychic sweep and start going to different areas to get her opinion about it. They start in the hospital, and she can feel that people were forcefully disrobed here. So again, a lot of cruelty going on in that hospital. And someone was trying to tell her, and the someone said, quote, "They didn't heal us here, came to die." Just, oh my gosh. And she said that person talking to her, that thing talking to her, was tall. It was a human-shaped figure, but it was very dark. It felt not human. It had a very predatory feeling around it. And she said it looked like a scarecrow with like a sack over its head. So they brought up the picture and showed her the inmates with their hood over her head, and that was exactly it. And she felt very, very sick. She had to take a break for sure. They went to cell block 1. She said she could just feel the pressure change as she walked through the door. There's a massive presence, very heavy in residual, but there was also intellectual there also. Sorry, I said also twice. And she could see someone sitting in the cell alone. It was trying to communicate, but nothing came through, but she could feel the fear and excitement coming from it. They go back to the rotunda, and they're not with Michelle anymore. They are starting their total investigation with just Jack, just Katrina. So camera 6, they're watching it, and there was a reflection, and it was coming from, I think, a fire can. Oh my gosh, I can't even think of the word. But, the red thing that hangs on the wall. There was a reflection coming off of that from their camera based on how it was facing. And it looked like someone walked in front of it. And Jack they instantly saw it. They were in base camp, and it came across the screen, and he was like, wait, what was that? And so Katrina went all the way down by the fire thing. Oh my gosh. And she, it's up high. It's like her shoulder height or something. And so something very, very large would have to cover up that reflection. So it's really cool to watch, because at first you're like, it doesn't look like a person, but they kind of slow it down, and it's huge. It had to cover that huge reflection. It's very cool to see. So they go to the hospital wing, and they bring a geoport with them, which, speaks when you ask it questions. And they say, "Who are you?" and it comes back and says, "Who is it? Who is it?" They say, "Where are we?" And he says, "Hospital." Then he comes through again and says, "There is no portal." So this show is called Portal to Hell, and he had mentioned at the very beginning that people think this is a portal to hell, and so it's very weird that it got brought up like that. They start hearing knocking all around them. So this is on camera. You can watch Katrina turn off the geoport, and then all of a sudden it turns right back on. So they're like messing with the dial. They're like, this takes a lot of effort to turn, and you can't even like see it on the camera. It doesn't pick up it turning to turn back on. It's very weird. So they ask again to make a noise, and one of the producers starts freaking out. He was trying to get a certain shot like off to the side where he had to stand into a cell to make this shot to look at them, and he heard people whispering at him. And what's really creepy is when they rewound the camera, they caught the whispering on the mic, and it sounded exactly how he described it. It was just like multiple voices all just whispering. And he was like traumatized. He could not believe what was going on. Katrina went to cell block 1 alone, sat in a cell with a camera and a hood. So she was locked in, and she had the geoport going. She put the bag on her head, and she started to feel extremely horrible for being in there and asking questions. So she didn't get any responses, but it was too much for her, and she left. And so Jack, he went on death row. He admitted to being very, very scared, and he could hear and feel something telling him to leave. He was talking with one of the producers, and all of a sudden the light fixture just right over his shoulder just starts swinging back and forth, pretty like a big swing. And so they're sitting there talking, they don't understand what's happening, and then all of a sudden it just stopped. So that was the end of the investigation. They went back and looked at everything, and I already spoke about everything they caught. There was nothing new to report. So Jack said, "There's no portal to hell here, but this place is very haunted." So I would love to go there someday. Probably in the daylight. I don't know if I'm ready to take a nighttime ghost tour, but I've been to one in Charleston. We went to the old jail, and it was very creepy. And I wasn't like as into it as I am now. So who knows? But I've heard so many amazing things about this, and it was really cool learning the history about it because there was so much I didn't know. And I grew up in Colorado. I grew up in the West, and so I don't know a lot about East Coast. You hear your history, but it was nice to learn more about Pennsylvania and Philadelphia too. So thank you all for listening. I appreciate it so unbelievably much. If you want to follow me, I have a Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and a YouTube. And I also have a Patreon if you guys would like to help support the show. It all goes straight back into the show, so I can purchase equipment. I can do what I need to do. I would love to get some more stickers going again, all kinds of stuff. So again, I appreciate you listening. Please join me next Wednesday for episode 34. And we are going to be heading to Indiana, and I'm pumped about this one, you guys. I think you're going to love it. Thank you again for all your listens, and I will see you guys later. Bye.